all of the pieces line up. So we'll just do a little framing at the end. So that's where we're headed tonight. I'm excited to be here in person to guide the conversation. So if you take a look at the presentation, I think it's in both places. Okay, it's sort of like around me, like surround sound. When we first came to talk about the equity audit, we talked about three phases, right? Phase one was this diagnosis of current state. And we're in the current state of our equity audit is that we are nearing the end of this diagnosis of current state phase. We're still waiting on a couple of the instructional audit findings, and then you'll see in yellow this report of findings. We will be producing a more formalized report of those findings, collecting them, but we don't do that in isolation until we have engaged the actual folks on the ground to have conversations around making meaning around the findings before we synthesize that. So that will be forthcoming, and part of what you're doing today is going to help us move that forward. We are in kind of a root causes conversation and early recommendations. We're starting our practices, our policy review, not board policies, but more like practices on the ground in terms of how attendance policies play out on the school site or how discipline policies are implemented on the school site. That's kind of where we are right now. We're in that phase two piece. As we get to June and going into early next year, we're looking at the implementation of those recommended reforms or changes, and so that's where we are. So we're not waiting to the end and producing a fancy report. You might, if you participate in the strategic planning process, you might know what that's like. We want to engage you along the way, so that's what we'll be doing tonight. So if we have a little layout of all the folks who are sort of participating and part of this process, and so I realize my superintendent cabinet slides aren't quite turned the dark blue yet, but we're about like in the first third phase. So we have several more engagements. I put on a June and an August TBD. We don't have the board sessions next scheduled as follow-ups, but I think we want to get on the agenda. We can figure out exactly when to come back with those final findings and kind of what that integration is. And then you'll see that we have several different groups that are still engaging in that meaning making. So we'll provide some more updates as we go through. So that's just a little bit by way of context setting. Okay. So this slide may be familiar to you, very familiar to some, or maybe a little bit kind of, I think maybe I've seen this. This is kind of our organizing framework for our strategic plan. And I think it's important to understand the equity audit as providing a lens on strategic planning, right? We had an equity-centered planning process, right? We were grounded in that, but now we're overlaying some specific findings to help us ensure that what we've produced is really hitting the mark on the areas of needs that have been identified. So what's highlighted in blue is really kind of where this lens is going to come into play as we complete some of the final components of the full plan. So one is taking a look at our equity principles as part of the plan. One is really thinking about those measures for student success, which you could think of like your equity benchmarks or metrics that we're going to be paying attention to. The other piece is really through the instructional audit, how are we ensuring that our instructional program and our professional practices are really accomplishing our goals? And then we'll also be taking a look at a lens on the strategies as well as alignment of resources. So that's sort of part of the process, the lens that will be applied to this work. I am going to pause there with some framing. We have an opportunity to I would love to hear questions that folks are holding. I won't go into a back and forth necessarily Q&A, but I think it'd be helpful to hear from each board member if you have something that you're kind of curious about or you'd like to know more about before we dive into the work that you're kind of like, I hope by the end of tonight, you know, we touch on X, Y, or Z. I'd love to hear from folks if you'd like to share. Yes. And I think you're supposed to use the mic.
Right on. I guess my question is, are we going to be addressing it by site or as a district as a whole or both?
That's a great question. The answer is both. As you know, and part of the planning process is we're taking a lens. You're going to be looking at some district-specific or district-wide data, but there's also site-level data that will be included, and the leaders are taking a look at this. So as they're working on developing their school improvement plans or their continuous improvement plans for next year, they will have specific actions in those plans that are associated with their school site that are aligned up with the district pieces. So there should be alignment there. And James, if you want to jump in on that too, you just let me know. Or Tasha or somebody. No? Okay. No. Thank you. Does that, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Talking, it's green. Oh my God, I hate. Oh, thanks. I appreciate you so much. After all of that, my question is, will the instructional effectiveness category also contain district practices that support the professional practices, or does that fall in another category? Do you got to turn it off? I'm not.
Yes. So what's the instructional effectiveness has 3 tiers. We look at classroom, so we look at sort of teaching practices, right? We look at the leadership practices across the site that's supporting, the implementation of those teaching practices, and then we have a whole set of organizational practices that are set aside to support both the leaders, the site leaders, as well as direct support to classroom practices. We were actually working on that today as part of our planning process with Director Callahan and Dr. Katsuda and Denise Wright. We're working on some of that today, so that will be forthcoming in terms of an update of what those practices look like, yeah.
I guess my question is that this is been a big bite and a mouthful to chew. And you've got 2 things you're going, we've got the strategic planning and all of that, and then the equity audit, which, is a nice dovetail and appropriate to do. I'm always concerned when I see stacks of paper like this and the digesting of all of that. The implementation process, is there latitude in terms of the implementation? And what I mean by that is, you've got it all here, but it doesn't mean we have to do it all right now, but the implementation timelines and chunking of the extra work, it's not extra work. I don't want to imply that it's more than, it's the right thing to do based on the research that's been done, but in terms of bringing it out, if you were to put that in front of me, I would, be a little bit skeptical, especially if I haven't been involved. What the district has been, I've been really excited about how many people have been involved, and staff and things of that nature. That doesn't mean everyone is, and so the implementation is kind of my primary concern, that we don't devour people by the sheer immenseness of what this looks like. So, what do we do with that?
You're hitting the nail on the head in terms of what separates effective implementation from ineffective implementation. So when we try to do everything all at once, we end up not going anywhere. And so part of what's most important is identifying what are the key priorities and the sequencing of that. And that is exactly what that 3rd phase is. And we're starting some of that in the conversation, in the discussion. So the process that you're going to go through today, the school leaders went through processing their individual reports, and then we're beginning the conversation of, like, if we just do one thing, what would that one thing be? And they had their take on it. And then the next part will be bringing in their leadership teams at the end of June to kind of go through a similar process, because nothing is going to be around, it's got to be co-constructed, but it also needs to be narrow. So we talk about what is our focus in year 1. And that might be, it's making some decisions around what you don't focus on, It doesn't mean that some things aren't happening, but it's about where we put our focus and align our resources. Yeah. And the resources, when I say that, I mean time, and I mean focus and personnel as kind of like what is the work we engage in together. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. Do you, we have had several meetings today, so can you refer which phasing you mean? Are you meaning with the professional learning as the example, or just in or the? Oh, implementation phasing, yeah. Yeah, so part of the conversation that we were having earlier today was around what are the phases of implementation, and how do we prioritize, like, creating, it's almost like concentric circles going out, right? So as we work to develop what some key priorities are, we focus in on working with our site leaders and leadership teams, right, and addressing, kind of implementing and trying to think about building those practices. And look at year 2, how are we broadening that? Site leadership teams bringing that back to their school sites. So there's kind of a phased approach in terms of the implementation work. That doesn't mean that it's only living in one group of people doing implementation, but it's sort of putting the focus on the capacity building of the system to be able to hold it. So that was I think the core of our conversation today, if that, yeah, okay. Yeah. Phase 1 for implementation? Yeah. So part of what gets identified in this next planning phase for implementation is what are those measures, not just of, you're going to have your vital signs of like student outcomes, your dashboard of those metrics, but you're going to have implementation measures that are around the adult practices. So if we say we're going to grow this practice in terms of instruction, what is the evidence that we're bringing forward that that's happened? So that's where we are. Yeah. That's great. Okay. All right. Sounds good. So let's dig in. I am going to do a little screen maneuvering over this. We're going to do a flyover. And just like that, we're back on time. Okay. So the second part, or the first kind of activity that we're going to do, is looking at this analysis of student survey data. In your packet, on your right-hand side, I believe, is all of the student survey data. We are not going to look at all that today. That's a very large packet. But we wanted you to have each school site's student survey report as to access. What I'm going to invite you to do is you're going to, at your tables, and I'm going to orient you to the data itself in a moment, but you're going to have about 15 minutes just to review a data set. And then at your table, have a discussion around what are the commonalities, the observations, the inferences, kind of the implications that you're seeing, and what students are sharing, right? And what students have told us in this survey data. And you had a fairly robust student response rate, and I want to commend all of the folks who worked to make that happen. It takes a lot of effort on the part of folks on the ground and folks here in the district office to get that kind of response rate, so I do want to elevate that's great. And so we're going to have that chance to kind of process it. And as our share-in at the end, after we've had that discussion, my question is going to be around, if you look at this set of questions or these set of measures, what do you think is most important for us to focus in on and track as we go forward? Again, to narrowing, right? It might be hard to do, but we're going to try. Yeah, we're going to try. So So just to orient folks to the student survey data report. Let's see, this one is the staff, I think. Okay, great. So I'm going to invite us to focus in. You're going to see the A, C, and E are district highlights, right? So they're district highlights versus the school level reports. And so you're going to decide if you're going to take a look at elementary, middle, or high when we start the activity. You can decide which data set you want to look at. If we scroll up, there's a little, so here's our first, this is the student survey results on page 1, which is technically page 2, but page 1 for the report. There's an executive summary page that first, just to orient you to this, it will tell you how many students took the survey. You had just over 1,000 elementary school students in grades 3 through 5 complete the survey. The highest rated questions are listed. Those are like the top 5 questions. And you can see the overall response rate. So for example, the top rated question, which was connected to student engagement, is question number 2 on the survey. I work hard to do my best in school. 94.6% of your students said, yes, I do. That's great. And then look at right there with it, number 26, my teachers expect me to always do my best. You had 94.2% of your students in elementary school said that. And look at, you'll see there's several of these that are there. When we go to the lower response rates, it's the lower response rates. It's not saying that they're necessarily too low or too high or whatnot. That's up to you to decide. But when we get to something like the question number 33, which is most students in the school treat each other with respect, we're down to about 73%, right, of students agreed, right? So this is kind of gives you just the overall response. Then we kind of rolled up the domains. Some people like to look at mean averages, so there's another way to look at the data. And it's by looking at the different domains: student engagement, safe, supportive school climate, supportive, trusting relationships, or quality of teaching and learning questions. And you can take a look. This is kind of in a one-page synopsis. The average responses, this was a 4-point scale for the elementary school students, where your average response rate is. So that's if you want to see that snapshot and also comparison between different student groups. Then we get into a very granular display of the data. And what you'll have in this display is you'll have each question listed. So here's that question number 2, right? I work hard to do my best in school. And you have that overall response rate of 94.6% of students having a positive response. If we separate out student responses by different groups of students, you can look to see if there are some students who had more positive responses or some groups of students that had more positive or less positive response rates. So for example, there's a spread here. If you take a look at across, this is for different schools, Butler Creek, they were at like 94.9%. Students said, I can do almost anything if I work hard enough. And then at Powell Butte, if you went, you're like 92.2% of students. So it's, even though it's shaded with like more positive or less positive, just note that when you're talking about a percentage or 2 percentage points, it's not really a huge statistically significant difference. When you start to see the real darker shading on a particular question, that's where you might see a real significant swing. So in terms of students' response rates. I do want to put one note is that there are some questions that are on a reverse scale, meaning you want to have a lower response, because the question is people are teased, right, repeatedly, or folks are bullied, and so you want to see a lower number. And so that's just a reverse scale. So we have it across, separated by schools. You have it by grade level, and you have it by gender, female, male, and you have it by race and ethnicity. And I think that's, oh no, we do have it. And we have students who are receiving special education services and students who are not in special education as the comparators. And then we have English language status as the comparator. So there's still a lot to to kind of dig through if you're doing elementary, right? So this is the same breakdown for each of the different student surveys. There's elementary, middle, and high. The difference with the high school and the middle school is that those were on 6-point scales. Those are on 6-point scales. So and they are reporting the agree and strongly agree. So just to know, it's just a slightly different scale. Yeah, okay, questions before we dig in?
Can I ask a comprehension question?
100%.
So if I look at just this first one here on the first green and red page, right?
Yep.
I can learn almost anything if I try hard enough. So the average 92% responded
Positively.
At Butler Creek, it was 2.2% higher than that.
Yep.
That 92.
You could just add
And
it,
at
yeah.
Meadows, it was negative.
It was 5% lower. Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's just, you just add the numbers. Yeah.
I've been out of math for a really long time, so I just like to make sure I understand.
Yeah, well, that's where the color coding comes in handy. You can see. Again, with a very light shading, I wouldn't belabor it. It's in the places where you see a real darker shading that it's exactly, or Super Bowl green. Yeah, yeah. And then also just taking a look at the overall averages, you don't want to. I encourage you not to undercount the fact that you actually have very positive response rates at your like at the elementary in particular for a lot of questions. So even if there is a somewhat of a differential, in general, you have some really high rates. Not for everything. Okay, I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything, and not every population. That's why we do it. That's why you have it. So when we're talking about our equity audit, we're talking about where are the consequential differences in students' experiences, access, and outcomes. This is talking to about consequential differences potentially in students' experiences, right? This survey was in April of this year. Yeah. Okay.
And then one more question.
Yes.
When you're comparing, third, fourth, and fifth grade students, there's going to be a difference between a brick and mortar school and a virtual academy. And it's they're apples, but there's two different varieties there. And so obviously you don't negate that population that we're trying to serve in that manner. But that's the piece where I would go, okay, now if I saw a large difference in that particular column, it's one of those, how do you weight that in terms of the total experience?
Yeah.
When it relates to the brick and mortar school versus the one virtual academy that we have, and not focus, because you know what happens? Your eyes go to the red.
Yeah, well, yes. And I will just make two comments on the CVA results. One is that in reflection and conversation, we were noting that some of the questions might not have been the most appropriate given their current learning environment. And so it's just to know that administering a future survey, we probably would want to think about some targeted questions regarding their current learning environment. We do, though, have the report too from NCUST from the full visit. So we did add in that instructional audit of those that school to help provide more lens and insight too. So this is just one thing, right? We're layering on multiple pieces of information to help us understand the experience and the stories that are happening right now. So we're going to go ahead. We're at the time you can decide which data set you want to look at, and we'll have a conversation about it. Oh my goodness, crazy. Here we go. I do want to invite you just to kind of start by just kind of looking at what are the facts, quote unquote, just the facts, ma'am. Like, what do you see? Like, I observe that some patterns I notice are just to kind of stay in that before we start to tell our reasoning about why we think something is it is. Just stick with those. And I am encouraging you to stay in the front of the book just for your own staying at the district level, but obviously every school's survey results are in there, so you can go where you get to choose where you want to go. Yes, ma'am.
Just doing elementary right now, you said staying.
You can choose. Sorry, I mean the front section of, not the front of the book, but the front, yeah.
The high school's in the back.
Yeah, you're like, sorry, I meant the front, I misspoke. Executive. Yeah, the district level, yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, let's go. We'll go. Let's start with 10 minutes.
Should we all at the same table be reading in the same age group or does it?
You don't have to. It's up to you. If you guys all want to dig into one, that's fine. But you can go, you can decide. But tell each other what you're taking a look at. Yeah. So in 3 minutes, I'm going to invite our board to share in kind of what's rising up for you as either specific questions or areas that you think are really should be prioritized for monitoring. We don't need to set any goals or things yet like that, but just what's really rising up for you as a critical area for monitoring. So just take a few minutes to gather your thoughts, and then we'll whip around. Okay, let's take 30 seconds. Okay, so I know there's a ton to process, right? And part of this is it's one piece of information. We're going to layer on more to try to kind of flesh out the story. You may find that you have follow-up questions. One of the things that we did with the site leaders when they processed this was, what are the questions you want to ask and of whom? You know, for follow-up to kind of get more information. But we want to hear from each of you as board members, you know, what is rising up for you as like critical for monitoring or moving, improving, okay? So who would like to go first?
Okay. So we looked at middle schools, and there was a number of things that stood out. Just general, the middle schools, both middle schools scored pretty high as far as being a safe and supportive climate. Where they struggled was student engagement and supportive and trusting relationships. The major problems were discrimination and harassment, sexual harassment, harassment based on gender identity, harassment based on LGBTQ status. That's really where it wasn't even as much the bullying as it was harassment. When you look at it broken down, I'll say two more things and then you can jump in if you want. When you break it down by gender, regardless of school, it's very clear that boys are much more confident in school. They feel more safe and supported. They report fewer major problems. And like almost conversely, the amount from the female students not feeling that way and not having that experience. And so when we look forward, I think, especially in middle school, we have to pay special attention to gender and building that confidence up in our female students. Similar with the special ed students, it was just very clear that when you look at special ed and non-special ed for as how they feel, do they feel safe and supported? Like non-special ed was all green and special ed was all red. So we're not doing a great job of making our special ed students feeling like they're safe and supported in the classroom as well. Those are a few of the things. There's other things too, if anybody wants to.
Okay, we'll pass it to Jess.
I think that was a good summary.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Can
Who
I,
was-
actually, can I say one more thing?
Yes, you may.
I
Of
just
cour- of
remembered it.
course.
I didn't write it down. It was something James had said. It's really fascinating when you look at the two middle schools and see where they are by grade level. So like at Oliver Middle School, the sixth graders feel great. They love it. They love everything about it practically. And the eighth graders hate everything about it, right? Whereas when you look at Centennial Middle School, the eighth graders are more positive and the sixth graders are more uncomfortable, don't feel safe and supported. So I think that, that really speaks a lot to how we did the transition, and there's some things that we did really well in the transition to both Oliver Middle School and sixth graders coming in. But there's definitely lessons to be learned, I think, in how both schools approach those things to get such difference in that age grade.
Okay, who's next? Thank you.
So Melissa is the one who really pointed this out, that questions 33 and 34 across the board are generally rated low, and it's a different scale for the elementary school, the elementary students, but still, secondary that's at the bottom as well. So,
Are you looking at high school? Sorry.
well, secondary, page 54, wherever you want to look. Questions 33 and 34 are in the lowest section. So Dr. Katsuda was talking a little bit about how you address that kind of thing, but I think it really, really needs to start in the elementary school, how kids learn to respect their peers and value the way those students treat their teachers as well. So that's about as far as we got. Yes, you can do it.
Oh my God, I'm learning. Okay, thanks. Let's just take a minute. I did the mic, guys. Just give me just a little feedback. Hey, thank you so much. Okay, one thing that I echoed that I saw that really was really kind of hard to read over and over again was a lot of kids don't feel happy at their school everywhere. They don't feel emotionally safe at school. They don't feel physically safe at school, and they're not happy in their buildings. And that is really painful to see over and over and over again. When where they spend the majority of their time every day, they're not happy to be at. That, to me, is something imperative to work on because it's tied to how they feel as a learner and how they feel as a human, and that's big.
Director Shields or Director Lynn?
It's overwhelming.
Hold on one second. I think,
It's just overwhelming. And in one thing, it's like, oh, woo, and then another is woo. And then I think about it as our children and students are bringing in all of the things that they bring in from outside of our schools that we need to address. And yet I wonder how much we can be responsible for and how much we can take on. So we were talking a little bit about the categories. Where should we and can we focus that would have the most impact on our students? And what's reasonable to expect from the people who serve, our teachers and our aides and these people who we entrust with these little souls, especially the littlest ones. So to me, it was just kind of this overwhelming, and how do you pick just one when it all feels like it needs to be addressed, and yet we can't always take on all things. It can't be all things to all people. So what is the most important thing we can do as a school district and our charge of education, as well as our societal responsibilities? That's a tough one for me to try to grapple with. So, but I do agree with Director Selesky when you were saying about the middle school and the gender issues in terms of the male and female, and how we commented about that as well, how our elementary girls and boys and elementary look, pretty good, and then we flip. And yet this isn't something that we've been dealing with for how long? And how long have we not been able to change that? And where is our responsibility? Again, as an educators, as the schools, what do we and how do we take that on? Because that is it's a global situation especially for our young girls, and especially in our middle schools. It's a tough time to be a girl.
I think too that what you speak to about the respect, like what we're seeing in the school climate is so representative of what we're seeing in society as a whole, and how folks don't have a lot of respect for their fellow people. And how, I think that it's interesting to see how the pandemic, I feel, created an exponential rise in disrespect, because everybody was really close to the family and all of that. But I don't know how, I hope that we can work to help solve this in the schools so that we can help to solve this in society as well. Our kids are not alone in dealing with these issues. It's representative of the environment they're in. So we can't hold you guys completely responsible.
So one thought to just share as you think about this question, and this is more looking at, for example, the high school data versus the middle school, but on the gender question. There are some questions that stand out, right, as where there's a real pretty significant disparity, like a 14 percentage point difference or swing. And those are, my teachers really listen to me when I talk to them. So our female students are not experiencing that in the same way that our male students are, by a pretty significant margin, right? Adults in this school treat students with respect, so female students are experiencing less respect, right? My teachers make sure that I'm engaged in my learning. There's a differential. My teachers check to make sure I understand what what they're teaching, and they notice that I'm having trouble learning something. So it's important to take a look at the questions, I think, where you see that biggest spread, because that can also take a look at what that, it can point you in the direction of work, you know, like where you want to focus, right? And that differential. Yeah, yeah, totally. And you have this spread, right, too, at the high school in terms of high level of stress. Again, that 14-point spread. So just to kind of help shrink the focus. So that's part of it, is if you can come up with a few questions that you want to lean into, understand more about. By doing that, you will have a more expansive impact across multiple questions. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Just to add on that, I mean, there's a 15-point spread, racial, ethnic discrimination or harassment, male and female at the high school. 3 in a row, sexual harassment, gender discrimination, racial and ethnic discrimination or harassment. It's pretty big.
And it's the opposite, right? It's the reverse, where the male students are experiencing that harassment at a significantly higher rate. So there's things to noodle on. I invited Director Lynn in, and then I realized I think he's not unmuted, or maybe we can't hear him through the speakers. Should I just put the speaker up to my speaker? Okay, let's try it, Director Lynn. So we can hear you now.
Where, you know, it doesn't raise to the level of big discipline, but just all this chaos, you know, the kids are experiencing in middle school particularly. And the 8th graders at Oliver, you know, I certainly noticed those numbers. But then everybody else mentioned everything else I wrote down. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you for this this sort of surfacing of some of the key ideas. Let's see how, I'm not that far off. That's great. So I'm going to invite you to close it for now and put it back in your folder. But welcome, continue followed up questions and noodling on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend some time with a school's instructional audit report, and I'm going to give you a pretty structured process for reading through. It's basically going to be reading a narrative of about 6 or 7 pages to process it through. Okay. You know, in retrospect now, I realize I could have maybe just printed one of the same for everybody, but then, you know, why not keep it a little bit exciting? So, so I have 2 copies of the reports of the different schools. So you get to decide which one you want to think about, which means, so we have the Centennial Middle School, Oliver Middle School, Centennial High School, Patrick Lynch, which I think is the only one that you have, Director Lynn, because I only linked that one. And then the Centennial Virtual Academy. And Pal Butte. So, if everybody wants middle school, it's not going to work. I just want to preview that. Okay. Okay. Yeah, hold on. Okay, so this is what we're going to do.
Well, no, but I'm just really.
They're going to arm wrestle. Okay. So before we dive into it, I want to explain kind of what we're going to do, okay? And this is before, I'm not going to give it to you yet because you're going to start reading in. So I'm going to take a few minutes to go over the structure of the report. This is important, so you spend your time focused on the parts that are most important for us to focus on tonight, okay? Then you're going to have 15 minutes to read and process, maybe even a little bit more. And then we're going to share in kind of what are the key takeaways that we're kind of elevating. The way that the reports are structured is that there are 3 areas for the instructional audit that were evaluated. And this is based on, these domains are based on a research base coming out of NCUST, which is the National Center for Urban School Transformation out of San Diego State University. And they have a robust research base on what schools that are serving students of color in more urban areas that are successful across the country and having transformative, barrier-breaking results in terms of supporting students in schools. They have taken that research base and then they evaluated the schools on their site visits with regard to those domains. So there are 3 different areas that are being reported on. One has to do with curriculum. So what is the challenge level of the curriculum that's being engaged in it with students. Then the other area is around effective and engaging instruction. What does instructional practice look like in the classroom, right? And then the third area is around a positive transformational school culture. You see that they put the culture at the bottom and those 2 pieces, that's their kind of like, this is where you want to have, if we can really land the plane, so to speak, in all these areas, we can have a huge transformation of our outcomes for our young people. So there's an abstract that gives you a summary. There's an abstract that gives you a summary of kind of like what the high-level recommendations are in each of those areas. So the abstract is like super high level. It's just 2 pages, gives you a little context on the report, and tells you what they think they're recommending for positive transformational school culture, access to challenging curricula, and effective instruction. All right, so that's where I recommend you start. Then it dives into each of those areas, okay? And it has an executive summary for each of those areas if you want to go a level deeper. So there's a section on positive transformational school culture and a couple of pages on their key findings and recommendations. And then there's a section on the challenging curricula and their key finding and recommendations, and then effective engaging instruction and key finding and recommendations. These reports, there's no page numbers because each report is like a different length and like, so you gotta kind of flip through. But I'm inviting you to take a look at the abstract, start with that, and then turn to one of the other sections. Might not have time to look through all the sections, but go where your interest is piqued. This is just to give you a flavor of what the product is coming out of this stuff. So where your interest is piqued, go and read that section. And then we're going to share some of our takeaways and kind of what are you hearing and layering this in, okay? Okay, so now we can arm wrestle over who wants what. All right, all right. Okay, in just a minute, we're going to invite you to chat with your tables. You might, a suggested approach is to maybe there was a quote or something that really stood out to you, or a sentiment that was shared that you underlined and highlighted that you want to elevate or share with your peers. And after you get a chance to elevate those, I'm curious for you to see if there's any commonality in what you're seeing, even if you're looking at different groups. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes just talking with one another, sharing what we're seeing, okay? Yeah, you can begin. Yeah.
Oh, you want me to talk to someone?
Yes, you can start talking, sharing your thoughts. Yep. We have 2 minutes till we share in some thoughts, and then we'll take our break. We're going to come back together in just 1 minute. So 60 seconds. So whoever is kind of sharing right now, it's going to be our last comment. So we're going to come back together. I'm glad that this. I'm glad that these reports have engendered so much discussion and dialogue. Excited to continue, but let's hear from one another before we take a short break and then do our last round of digging into some data. We're going to end with our staff survey data. But before we do that, let's hear from our board members. Just kind of anything what are you chewing on right now? Like what sort of that's based on the report. It's not, you don't have to summarize, synthesize, or report out on the content, but just what's kind of a big idea that you're wrestling with or thinking about to inform our work. Go ahead.
Patrick Lynch. So I didn't talk about it at our table, but 59% of the students were regular attenders. So it's not a big idea. It's been around a long time that attendance makes a difference. And maybe sticking to the basics is something that we need to consider as an option.
Yeah.
I was just sharing with Melissa this really great idea, right? Yeah, super
novel, very new,
very
very-
novel. It's like I know that the time is the limiter, right? Time to learn, time to do, and the thing that was in the high school was the no opt-out culture piece, which is all of us can succeed, right? And the agreement amongst the staff members to two really good practices that we know will have impact on our students, right? But getting the time to learn and fine tune and hone in on those two practices that we collectively have agreed to do is piecemeal in the sense of we do have our PLCs, right? But it's only X amount of time. And I just said to Melissa, why are we starting school right after Labor Day or whenever we do? Let's just start it, at the end of September, first part of October, and all we do for the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks is just intensive work with our faculty and our support staff to be able to integrate this into what they're going to be doing. And what would that reap if we were able to give that time to our professionals to be able to then go fresh into the classroom, ready and able to do what we're asking them to do rather than doing it in piecemeal. And I know we'd have to write all sorts of things to the state of Oregon saying, oh yeah, we're having a little problem meeting the minimum number of minutes in a classroom situation, but how much more would you benefit in terms of the learning outcomes with students if the kind of intensity that we could offer our teaching staff and those who support our teaching staff.
You guys do
to
that, I'll
do that.
resign and come teach here.
I mean, it doesn't fit in the model of what we know because we do little chunks, but the fact of the matter is, that when you're allowed to sit and concentrate on something for a period of time, leave it and come back, even if leave it and come back is tomorrow, there's greater impact than leave it and come back 2 weeks from now as it's being rotated through something. So when do we allow ourselves to do the big idea? When do we allow ourselves to have that kind of time and commitment to to the art of teaching that's been identified, you know, and staff has agreed to. None of the top-down type of situation, but truly done by the research. What kind of impact would that be? Anyway, it's very pie in the sky, but it's something that I think about a lot in terms of what could really have systemic change in a district. But it also would be an interesting, I'd like to go see you to explain that down in Salem.
But I know that what we do for our mentors is every year in September, we have a reset week, right? Where we do no youth service at all, and we focus on the professional learning topics. Because what that does is everybody is there. What happens when it's spread out is that somebody's sick on that day and then somebody's sick on, so somebody's always missing something. So it's really hard to have that consistency. So that week gives us that consistency, and people come out of it feeling really motivated and engaged to do better work. So I'm all for it, anyway.
It's a tough thing, and you have to change. I mean, we've had in-service for forever, and in-services at districts have gone from 2 weeks to 3 days. I mean, it's ridiculous the amount of time we've taken away from those times for our professionals to get together and have that kind of time. And then when we shorten the amount of time that they have, we also say, by the way, do this, this, and this in your classroom, et cetera, et cetera. When do we take away all of those things? Or you give them the time up front to do the things that they need to do in the classroom environment to get themselves ready to instruct, and say, and now, this is our commitment, this is what we're gonna do. It's a tough thing, and I really like the way you describe what you're able to do. And why aren't we in education able to do the same thing for the very people that we send into the classroom on a daily basis, that kind of commitment and then support for that, right? Because that feeling of support, just as you said they were reinvigorated, had a sense of feeling like, I'm ready, right? And that's the piece that sometimes I think we just continue to put on more and then don't give time for it to sink in, which is unfortunate in our environment.
That's great.
I do so many things. To bring it back, yes, to this, because yes, all that sounds great. We can have a summer institute. That'd be good. Couple things that, yes, paid. A couple of things that pop up that I heard repeatedly and eavesdropped over there is the lower expectations and the low rigor from elementary through middle through high, and that is fixable and doable with a shift in culture. And some of the findings are tied to attendance, but the attendance is tied to the relationship that the child will feel to the school. So some of the findings and recommendations are how to have that transformative culture. It starts with the relationship, but then you can't leave out the rigor piece, and you've got to raise the expectations of what you believe your students are capable of. And then another large overall theme that I noticed was consistent structures, procedures, and routines around behavior, around classroom management, around PLCs, around staff PDs, all of those areas. There's room for growth across the board, and students are mentioning it just as much as teachers are, which I found fascinating, because sometimes we don't think that they're paying that much attention, but wow, they are. So if those themes are popping up in elementary, middle, and high school, a wonderful area of professional development maybe could be that sort of gathering of where all of the schools, no matter what ages they're serving, are looking at those strategies, their procedures, their routines, their expectations, their guidelines, and all of that, which would then lead to better relationships, which would then lead to better attendance.
Which would also lead to less behavior issues, because I think that one of the things that the middle school staff asked for a lot was like more consistent structures, stuff, especially around behavior, right? And one of the things that was called out was that disciplinary, according to both staff and students, disciplinary consequences were inconsistent. Teachers, some staff ignore or do not handle racism or bullying when it occurs, right? And so, knowing that, you know, there's a statement in here about how we need all educators to understand that student misbehavior is often due to real social emotional needs and should not be interpreted as they're unwilling to learn, right? And I think that tends to get in the way sometimes, especially when you have a chaotic environment that you just want some clear structure in, that you're looking for the answer is more behavior structure, when really the answer is more relationship with your students. And I hope that there's a way that we can embed that in this as well.
And they go together.
Yeah.
If you envelop and develop those procedures and routines and structures, you then allow
Yeah.
the development and fostering and nurturing of the relationships, which lower the behaviors and increase the output that students give. But you also have to increase that rigor of what you expect
Yeah.
for them, and can't let them run away to the child care center to play with kids instead of do the biology, right?
Yeah.
Like that, all of those things go together.
I had Oliver Middle School, and it was all the same sorts of themes. This is my first time hearing the no opt-out culture. I did like that, hearing that, I think that absolutely, like, we're on the right track of engagement brings that, and that expectation. And when you trust someone, you want to be there, and you believe that someone is looking out for your best interest, then it will create the mind to want to be to keep active with it and to keep addressing it. One thing I also found interesting that I mentioned briefly at the end about the middle school is they wanted more after-school programs. Like, they want more electives, teachers and students. And I found that to be interesting because, in the student survey before, they didn't want to be at school in the middle school, but yet they want more after-school activities. So it just leads me to think, like, maybe we're just not giving them the right, we're not providing the right curriculum to have them learn. Maybe we need to rethink what we're teaching, or how, like, look at the end result and how do we get there that will keep them engaged, by switching up curriculum. It really, let's just change it, because what's happening, it doesn't seem to be working. And a lot of the curriculum that they had, the findings were that it was very much memorizational and very much, I just memorize it, because 2 + 2 is 4 because it says so on the chalkboard, and 2 + 2 is 4. And it didn't take it to the next level of, like, well, why is 2 + 2 4? And and if you just memorize a table, I mean, this happens to my daughter too. She memorizes the answers. Hey, I got all the answers right. Woo! So what'd you learn? Nothing. I learned that 3 + 3 is 6. So it's just, yeah. Yes.
Great. All right. Thank you all for digging in. Really, I really appreciate it. Yeah, David, you've been invoked. You've been called in to share your thoughts if you would like to. Hold on.
No, everybody, it's already been mentioned what I had written down. Thank you, though.
Thank you. Okay.
Yes, I did virtual academy, and I focused mostly on the transformational. What is that called? The
School culture.
positive transformational culture, given where they're at in their development, and really favorable. Quite a few strengths in terms of from all stakeholders, staff, students, parents, in terms of the learning environment. Teachers being responsive. Students portrayed the school as fun, and that teachers are very supportive, responsive, and mindful of the different family dynamics, which seems to be working for the kiddos. Not without its concerns. They talked about orientation, which is their intake, is a very cumbersome process. But what we were talking about, which is really interesting, is given that it is as cumbersome, we just had questions about the fact that they're so connected and favorable in terms of the experience. And so we were just, wondering about that process may be really effective, but how do we do that so that it's more manageable for on the system? Another thing that came up was the need for a designated IT staff member for that technology support, which I'll just say was a surprise to me. Like, I hadn't thought about that. And then just caseloads, that kind of goes with the open enrollment and the fluctuation. And I can say that that's usually within, different grade bands more than the others. And then the other concern, just briefly around the challenging curricula, is really about real-time interventions. And then the question came up about receiving Title I services for our elementary kiddos, also something that we haven't gotten to yet. So I think that captures.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to take 5 minutes just to get up, move around, take a little break, and we're going to come back and dig into the staff survey as our final layer of discussion. Oh yeah, we're wrapping. Don't worry, don't worry. We have one. We actually even changed it up to help us. Yeah, yeah, for sure. So we wanted to. The last portion that we wanted to do was touch on the staff survey, and so the way we're going to do it is I'm going to share with you some crosswalk of the students and the staff responses to similar questions so you can kind of get a glimpse. And then I'm going to share with you the full report, but we're not going to dig into it, at this time in super detail. But there's some interesting things in just kind of that crosswalk. So just to begin, and this is just up here or behind my head. So we lined up the survey responses. We have the elementary school survey, the secondary survey. These are the overall agree, right, strongly agree or agree statements in terms of the percent positive responses. So for school climate, there are two questions that kind of were parallel across the board. One, the staff survey says the school is a welcoming place for all students. That's the question they have for that first one. And staff make sure that all students feel like they belong. So that's kind of, it's in the bottom, you can see the phrasing, but it's the same idea. There's about welcoming, safety, and then belonging. So for our elementary school students, you see they were in the mid-80s in terms of their overall positive responses. Our secondary students were at about the 40s, and our staff were kind of split the difference there in terms of like about 60, just over 60%. Communicating that they agreed or strongly agreed with those statements. For supportive school environments, supportive and trusting relationships, this first one talks about care. So like my teachers care about me, or staff show that they care about all students. There's the question about students are treated fairly. So then they're what does staff say, etc. Adults ask for suggestions from students, etc. So just to point out what's an interesting trend and not something that we see all the time, actually not very often, there's a pretty strong tracking across the board in all of the responses, with some exceptions, to the staff responses and the overall secondary survey data. So a lot of continuity. So like if you take a look at question number 2, there students are treated fairly by adults in the school, or in this school, adults treat all students fairly. You have just over 45% of staff and secondary students saying that happens. Okay. If we go into the next one, these are the major problems one. This is the reverse scale questions. So bullying and then harassment. This is one of the places where it's a little bit tipped. And so it could have to do with the staff survey is inclusive of elementary and secondary, and if we tease it out, it might be slightly more reflective of some of those. But the question here, students definitely reporting higher responses on the harassment side of their experience in terms of sexual harassment, gender discrimination, LGBTQ status, sexual orientation, and ability status, right? As being higher, and staff saying that maybe not seeing as much of it. This one's too small to read, so I'll just say sorry. But this one's around quality of teaching and learning. You can see just kind of from the bars, the tracking, I think, just to kind of get a sense. Again, the first question has my teachers demonstrate that learning mistakes are part of learning. Again, there's quite a bit of tracking between the staff survey and the secondary student survey results in terms of overall. And then the last one around quality of teaching and learning, there's a little bit of a discrepancy. Staff kind of rated themselves lower than students did across the board in terms of providing instructional materials that reflects my identity. And then slightly lower in terms of only 45% of staff saying that they agree or strongly agree that teachers want students to become better thinkers and not just memorize things. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to pass out the staff survey, let you peruse it a little bit, and just have a chance to talk briefly and touch on any things that are kind of standing out to you. I encourage you, when you look at the staff survey, just for now, maybe stay with the black the black bars just to see the overall percentages. And you can definitely have a follow-up on some of the differential. There are clear differentials in terms of different staff status and their experiences. So the staff survey is in the left-hand pocket. And we'll just take, I'm going to give you just, we're just going to spend 10 minutes kind of processing. We'll definitely come back to it.
Is staff, there's a lot of staff.
Yes.
in this school district. Does staff mean the teaching people inside the classroom? Or even I mean, every staff member interacts with students. But in terms of delivery.
Yeah. If you go to page 9, you'll see the breakdown of the different roles. So we have licensed staff, classified, operational, and administration.
Did you notice a big difference in the amount of staff who responded that were secondary staff versus elementary staff? Because I don't necessarily see.
I don't have that figure for you, but we can follow up.
Just only because if it's like, it looks like they're tracking more with that, is it because they're.
It may be. It may be. Yeah, we'll take a look. Just one thing to note, if you do look at the role differential, there's, in this copy is the unedited, unfixed copy. On page 10, under operational staff, for the quality of teaching and learning section, that should just be X'd out. They did not respond. Those questions were not in the survey. So the reason those numbers are like that is because it's all 0, because they didn't respond to it. So that big row of red, just cross it out. Yeah. For quality of teaching and learning, for the operational staff only. So we're going to invite you in just a moment if you want to start. We're going to about 6 or 7 minutes just to elevate any things that stick out to you, either as positives or questions or concerns. All right, my friends, we're going to come together to close out. Just leave an opportunity. We have 8 minutes left. Promise we'll end on time. But just want to open the space to allow just any kind of anything you're holding that you want to just share, lift into the space regarding processing the staff survey.
This is not your fault.
Yeah, it's okay. It's all right. It's current state.
That happens, and two, like, they're not even aware of what is an insult or harassment to a young person these days. And how do we even stay up on that, right? Like, some kid could be calling some kid, you know, I don't know, a card, right? I just threw that out there. And we don't know how offensive that could be because that's the newest slang from TikTok. So I think that one of the things that we really need to do is partner with our students to understand what that harassment means to them and what that looks like to them, so that then we have the opportunity to interrupt.
Anybody else would like to chime in?
We had a good conversation about how it's hard to have a racially diverse staff if your racially diverse staff members don't feel safe, or that they can like encourage other people to take advantage of programs that allow, you know, education to move towards licensed staff. And that is it's a large puzzle to figure out. But if people don't want to look at changing behaviors and perceptions and adjust and be more responsive and culturally appropriate and question the things that they do, those shifts are really hard. And the heavy lift falls on people to encourage others to want to be in our school district, but they don't feel supported. So nobody wants to come if people don't like it. Like it's hard. Crappy.
David, do you want to just give you an opportunity to share if you'd like to? No pressure.
No, thank you. No, it really stood out to me, the kind of discrepancy on one question, the accountability to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was a big discrepancy between administration and staff. And then we've seen that kind of reflected in later, particularly in the Asian Pacific Islander column on one page. So accountability in terms of these issues is something I really noticed and I hope to see going forward. And to particularly what barriers are there in terms of holding people accountable to the new standards.
Thank you, Director Lynn. Okay. So we processed a number of pieces, right? This wasn't, I really want to appreciate your engagement. The discussion you're having is mirroring what we're having with all of the different groups that we're meeting with, as we shared on that slide earlier. And all of what you're elevating as the key areas we're going to be pulling together to utilize as a lens to revisit both the practices and the strategies that we have in the strategic plan, right? Just in terms of lifting up, there might be things that are missing that haven't been named or not as explicit yet. So that's part of what will be brought back to y'all. But I'm going to turn it over to the superintendent to just say any final closing comments.
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate the facilitation this evening. Thanks for coming out here and preparing all of this information for us. I think that the heat maps are really beneficial. I think that the executive summaries with the trends that help to identify, top-rated items and lowest-rated items are helpful. That way you can quickly be able to at a glance and not spend a lot of your executive functioning trying to understand the data, but you're able to analyze it. So I thought that that was valuable. One of the things that the chair and I talked about just as we were getting started with this closing was, while the information that we're seeing is a little bit sobering and, not what you would hope to see for our students, at least we're seeing it. It exists whether or not we're at the table looking at it. And as Dr. Southerton here would say, the only way through it is through it. And, it's there whether you see it or not. So at least we're at the point of being able to surface these data points to be able to know how best to address them. The first, part of addressing something is being aware of it. So I think that that's a valuable piece. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to the chair.
Thank you very much, everyone. At 8:28, our meeting is adjourned.